Roland Griffiths, who's one of the pioneer researchers in psychedelics at Johns Hopkins University. And if you don't know him, he is probably one of the premier researchers who has looked at end-of-life anxiety and trying to help people with the use of like psilocybe, which is a compound that's found in what people would know as sort of magic mushrooms, in terms of helping existential crises, end of life, et cetera, et cetera. And he is in his 70s, and he was just recently diagnosed with metastatic stage 4 colon cancer. And so it's a discussion about him and his own process with the diagnosis of this metastatic colon cancer. But also he has a very extensive mindfulness and meditation background. And in the article, he, talks a little bit about the benefits of doing mindfulness, of doing meditation. And there's a few quotes that I just wanted to pull out. And essentially, his whole message is let's wake up, sort of like, let's wake up world, that we don't need a terminal cancer diagnosis to wake up to the beauty of life. And I'm going to say that again. We don't need a terminal diagnosis to make us wake up to the beauty of life. And that there is a way, right, to actually wake up to the beauty of life every day by doing these practices. And in fact, one of the, if you go back to any of the recordings on the introduction to mindfulness or the basics of mindfulness or any one of the sort of, introductory sessions we've done, there's a term that I've used before, which is essentially, it makes the ordinary extraordinary. It makes the ordinary extraordinary because we're actually in the present moment. Right? How many times have you looked at a flower, or somebody, maybe even a child, points out something and you're like, oh, I really never have looked at it like that before. And because you're in a certain state, or you're in a certain space, or you're with a certain person, you look at it a little differently. And that might actually be that you're looking at it from the perspective of totally being in the present moment and seeing, for instance, it for the first time with presence. It makes ordinary things extraordinary. Oftentimes kids do this because they are perceiving the world sort of for the first time, or they're so present moment awareness that that it's like when they see a flower, they're like, oh, wow, look at that flower. Right? Or when they see a buzzing bee. Right? My wife was telling me the other day that that they spent half an hour looking, like being with a bee that was on the pavement, and for some reason it couldn't fly, but my daughter was with the bee for about 30 minutes, investigating it, trying to figure out what it does or what it was doing, or, et cetera, et cetera. And my wife just sort of allowed it to happen, right? And went into that present moment. And so really about waking up. So there's a few quotes here that I'd like to take from this article. That was just in New York, the New York Times Magazine over this last weekend. So he has a strong practice in Vipassana. meditation, which is a type of meditation that we have also practiced here. It's pretty much the basics of mindfulness, focusing on the nature of the mind, as they says, of consciousness. And one comes to see that thoughts and emotions are transient, right? We've talked about all those. And what he says is, through this practice, what was incredibly useful is that the best way to be with this diagnosis was to practice gratitude for the preciousness of our lives. Gratitude for the preciousness of our lives. And that's quite beautiful. And he goes into, how he went through all the emotions of anxiety, depression, fear, etc. And essentially he said, those were choices. Essentially, he said, it just didn't seem like it was wise for me to spend much time in the anxious world or the depressed world. And that these were actually choices that he had, which is really interesting, right? Because some people feel like these aren't choices. They sort of happen, and we're forced into them. And he talks about the relationship with his children, his grandchildren, his siblings, his wife. After being together with his now wife for 13 years, they never thought, or 11 years, they never thought it was important to get married. And then one day they just, because of the diagnosis, for whatever reason, they said, "Hey, let's get married." And he has a few things in here. He did do a session with LSD, and he talks about that specifically, mostly going into it with very specific questions, and seeing what answers came back. And one of the things that he talks about, so they go into, how LSF psychedelics, both studying them and using them, help prepare you for death. So this is interesting, because this is there's a big parallel here. There's a big parallel here between actually the use of psychedelics and mindfulness and some of the language that we use. In fact, a lot of the people who are guiding these experiences have extensive backgrounds in mindfulness, meditation, trauma, et cetera, et cetera. So their first study essentially showed that a single dose of psilocybin produced large and enduring decreases in depression and anxiety. And these were people who had life-threatening diagnoses and who had 6 months to live, essentially. They've now treated hundreds of participants with psychedelics. And one of the key things that we teach them is that upon taking this psychedelic, there's going to be an explosion of interior experiences. I love that, right? An explosion of interior experiences. Okay, because that's actually when we start to investigate inside, regardless of what you're doing, even if you just start practicing mindfulness and you start paying attention, let's say, to your breath, you might start noticing other things. Oh my God, my mind is just racing. All I have is thoughts, right? And so there may be sort of this explosion of interior experiences when you're actually practicing mindfulness. And so one of the things he says is we ask them, what we ask them to do is be with these experiences, be interested and curious. Be interested and curious. Okay. Which, if you go back to some of the definitions of the mindfulness that we've used, coming out of John Kabat-Zinn, coming out of UCLA, there's this description of the definition of mindfulness as being with the present moment experience with openness and curiosity. With openness and curiosity. Right, so there's this There's this curiousness that we can investigate, almost like a child, right? And that's why being with children sometimes makes us recognize, like, whoa, I haven't really ever looked at the color of that plant, because they help us investigate. They help show us how they are investigating something curiously. And that actually can shift us and be like, oh, wow, I never really looked at the detail of how this stitch is, but it's actually quite fascinating, quite remarkable. In fact, it's amazing that somebody could come up with that and create a machine, and then you get this hat out of, it's sort of like, then you go down that, right? Like, wow, it's amazing. There you go. Okay. And so when you practice mindfulness or meditation, that what arises is simply the present moment, and we become aware of it with curiosity. We don't shove it away. We don't push it down. In fact, if we resist it, oftentimes it persists. And so what we do teach in mindfulness is sort of, allowing yourself, learning how to redirect your attention to something you do want to pay attention to. But you're not squashing things that are appearing. You're just sort of choosing where you're placing your attention. Okay, so doing so with an openness and curiosity. The other thing is that you don't have to figure anything out. That's what he says. That they do have guides on the outside who help them create safety, but that these are not feel-good experiences, right? How many times in even a mindfulness session, it wasn't that pleasant, right? Where you're like, wow, that session just sort of made me realize how stressed I was, or how tense I am, or, that session, my mind was racing so much that all I did is I just worried during that entire session. They're not always feel good sessions. Okay. People can have experiences in which they feel like they come to this beautiful understanding of who they are and what the world is, but people can also have frightening experiences. The preparation we give for these experiences is to stay with them, be curious, and to recognize the ephemeral nature of them. If you do that, you're going to find that they change. And that's really an important concept in anything that we are experiencing. That as we stay with something, as we're curious about it, even as we're curious about a sensation that we may feel, pain in the knee, pain in the shoulder, pain in the elbow, that if we actually stay with it and allow it and not resist it, that it actually has a quality of this sort of changing, amorphous quality to it, which is really neat. The metaphor we use is imagine that you're confronted with the most frightening demon you can imagine. It's made by you for you to scare you. I love that, right? It's made by you for you to scare you. Okay, then he goes on to say there's nothing in consciousness that can hurt you. So what you want to do is be deeply curious, and if anything, approach it. If your natural tendency is to run, it can chase you for the entire session. But if you can see it as an appearance of the mind, then you go, oh, that's scary, but yeah, I'm going to investigate that. Right. So the reason I'm bringing this up is because this may actually happen in a meditation session. Something might arise, maybe a memory of something might arise that may seem scary. And if you're resourced and have gone through and are practiced in sort of finding an anchor and something does arise, that we can open to it, maybe with some sort of curiosity and acceptance. And then the final paragraph, which I think is sort of, the clincher to this, is his last, the question by the interviewer is, what's the most important thing for everyone else who's still asleep to know? I want everyone to appreciate the joy and wonder of every single moment of their lives. We should be astonished that we are here when we look around at the exquisite wonder and beauty of everything. I think everyone has a sense of that already. It's leaning into that more fully, leaning into enriching, actually cultivating joy and happiness, right? Taking that moment and leaning into it, enriching it, actually being with it, actually as we sense it and notice a moment, a joy moment or a happy moment or any positive moment that appears, that we actually lean into it, that we actually place our attention towards it. And that's it's so important, because that allows us to then, it's sort of like that's our practice, right? And then what we repeat, then that becomes a state and it becomes a trait. Right? So if we're leaning into this joy and appreciation and gratitude of life, and we're enriching that, then those are the types of neurons that are going to be firing in our brain. And over time, that actually then becomes a state of being. Okay. So I think everyone has a sense of that already. So that's really beautiful, right? It's like everyone has this sense, but we really need to lean into it more and help each other, I feel. There is a reason every day to celebrate that we're alive, that we have another day to explore whatever this gift is of being conscious, of being aware that we are aware. That's the deep mystery that I keep talking about. That's to be celebrated. We sort of covered the main points of it, which essentially is, I think his point is sort of like, wow, after all this meditation and mindfulness and Vipassana practice, there was still waking up that I had to do. And the waking up was sparked by this terminal illness diagnosis, right? And so what he's saying is, why did I need this, right? Did I need this? And how can we get more people to wake up to the beauty of this life in every single moment without having a terminal illness diagnosis, right? So that you don't need to, and that this is actually present for us all, that we all have this sense. And it's really about leaning into it. It's really about leaning into this beautiful mystery, this experience that we're all having, right, together and in unison and whatnot, and exploring consciousness and exploring what is this ability to be aware of awareness, right? That thoughts and emotions and appear, that I can be aware of them, that I can follow them and create, right? Like I can create a hat that I can wear, or a skyscraper, right? Or a chair that you can sit on and be comfortable, through a thought that emerges. And it's like, oh, let's do that, right? Manifesting object reality, physical forms. But yet also being aware of our thoughts and our emotions and our sensations, and not getting so caught up in them, being like, I'm right, you're wrong. This is, because in awareness, there is no right or wrong. Right? There's no good or bad. It just is. It's just what's appearing. This is happening. Okay. So in today's practice, what I'd like to do is essentially sort of go into, it's a type of technique, but it's not. It is a technique. Right. So It's essentially not doing anything. So what we're gonna do is not do anything. So there's no technique. There's no focusing on your breath. There's no focusing on an anchor. There's no focusing. There's no doing anything. Well, the only thing you're doing, and so we could get into a semantics discussion about this. The only thing you're doing is you're not doing anything. Okay, so in the doing nothing, you're doing something, but yet do nothing. And anytime that you are doing something, see if you can allow that to just be, like notice it and just let it be, right? So that anytime something sort of emerges that is like, yo, I'm thinking about something, be like, oh, okay. So there is the aspect of then doing in the, can you just drop the thinking, right? It's almost as if anything that emerges, we're not latching onto, but we're just sort of like, anytime you recognize that you're doing something, try not to do it. Try not to do it. Okay. And so there is a bit of doing in the trying not to do it. And notice, we've mentioned this before, but see if you can, if you pay attention right now to your life, what's appearing in this moment for you, right? Notice if there's any resistance to that. It's appearing. And resistance can seem like anything that you wish to change from the present moment. So if there's anything that you wish were different for this, like for just this practice or even this split second, see if you can allow that to just be. Like, oh, I wish I was X, or I wish I didn't have this, or I wish I didn't have this pain, or I wish I didn't have a diagnosis of metastatic cancer. And just see if you can pick up the resistance in 5 minutes. It's your choice. See if you can just drop that resistance. Anything that comes up in the practice of like, oh, I wish this would change, or I wish this was different, or this, notice that. Okay, notice that appearing and just see, oh, can I just let that be for now? Even if it's like a split second. And so this sort of like radical acceptance, radical allowance, whatever you want to call it, right? Total beingness, whatever it is, but just see if you can do that. See if you can do it. Okay. So that's going to be our practice for today. Okay, so let's find a comfortable posture. A posture that you feel relaxed yet alert. Closing your eyes if you feel comfortable closing your eyes. If not, having a soft downward gaze. As if you're looking down off the horizon, over the ocean, a sunset. And just taking a few deep breaths and allowing yourself to settle into your chair, couch, bed, whatever surface you're on. And for this practice, allowing yourself to just be. That there's nothing you need to do. That everything is perfect just as it is in this moment, arising. And anytime you notice yourself feeling like you need to do something, recognizing that desire, and just seeing if for this practice you can put that to rest. That there's nothing we need to focus on. Just allowing yourself to be present. You can notice what appears, and simply allow it to be. With any time you feel that you're doing something, seeing if you can rest the doing. That there's absolutely nothing to do. And just be. And noticing if there's anything we're resisting, any resistance to the present moment, and seeing if just for this practice, even if just for this second, anything that you're resisting to allow. Just noticing where your mind is now. Allowing any activity to rest. There's nothing to do. There's no technique to use. Simply allowing yourself to be present by doing nothing. Allowing your doing mind to rest. Simply being. Now taking 2 or 3 deep breaths, feeling the oxygen traveling through your body, feeling your whole body breathe, feeling your feet on the floor, whatever surface they're on. Opening your eyes if your eyes were closed. Stretching if you feel like you need to stretch. And just reflecting on this practice today.